I'm Elena Marshall, and 3 weeks ago, I stood in the mirrored ballroom of the Grand Excelsior, wearing a six-figure silk gown, and realized I was standing in a room full of ghosts. Picture this. The Sterling Group's annual Sapphire Gala. 500 of the most powerful people in the city, men in $7,000 tuxedos and women dripping in diamonds that could fund a small country. The air smelled of expensive lilies and vintage champagne. I was the guest of honor, the janitor's daughter who had supposedly made it to the top. I was engaged to Julian Sterling, the heir to the Sterling real estate empire, and tonight was my induction into their world. Julian was at the front of the room, standing at table 1, the VIP circle. He looked perfect, his dark hair swept back, his smile as polished as the silver on the table. Beside him sat his mother, Constance, the queen of the city's social ladder. She was glowing, holding court with the mayor and 3 billionaire investors. I was supposed to be in that chair next to Julian. But before the first course was served, I did what I always do. I checked on my patients. Or in this case, my parents. I'd spent weeks ensuring Dave and Linda Marshall were comfortable. I'd told Julian 1,000 times that tonight wasn't just for us, it was for them. For the 35 years my father spent scrubbing the very floors these people walked on. For the nights my mother worked the graveyard shift at the public hospital to pay for my nursing school. I wanted them to see the view from the top. I walked toward the front, but the 2 chairs at table 1 were empty. Julian didn't look at me, he was too busy laughing at a joke the mayor made. I pulled a passing server aside. The Marshalls? Dave and Linda? They were supposed to be at table 1. The server looked at his tablet, then pointed toward the back. Not the back of the room. The back of the building. Overflow Room B, Mississippi downstairs. Near the service elevators. I felt the first cold prickle of dread on the back of my neck. I didn't wait for the elevator. I ran down the service stairs, the silk of my dress catching on the industrial metal. I pushed open the heavy fire doors of Overflow Room B. It was a concrete box. No windows. No lilies. Just 6 folding tables covered in paper cloths. The sound of the industrial dishwashers in the next room was a dull, rhythmic thud. And there, at table 40, sat my father. He was wearing the tuxedo I'd bought him, his back straight, his calloused hands folded neatly on the table. My mother sat beside him, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. They were sitting next to a stack of empty crates and a janitor's closet. I looked at my father, the man who had taught me that a person's worth is measured by the work they leave behind, not the title on the door. He looked up at me and smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's okay, Elle," he whispered. "We can hear the music from the vents. It's a beautiful party." That was the moment the floor gave way. I realized I wasn't just looking at a seating error. I was looking at a map of how the Sterlings truly saw me and everyone I loved. And as I turned back toward the stairs to find Julian, I knew one thing with absolute, terrifying certainty: the woman who walked back into that ballroom wasn't going to be the same woman who left it. To understand why my parents were in the basement, you have to understand the hands that put them there. My father, Dave Marshall, didn't have a degree. He had a bucket, a mop, and a back that never stopped aching. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house in South Chicago where the radiator hissed all night and the windows rattled every time the L train passed. My childhood smelled like industrial bleach and pine sol. That was the scent of my father coming home after a 12-hour shift cleaning the Sterling Group's headquarters. He used to tell me, "Elena, floors don't lie. If you do the work, the shine stays." My mother, Linda, was the one who made sure the shine stayed on me. She worked the night shift in the hospital laundry room, folding sheets until her knuckles bled, just so I could have a private tutor for the SATs. We didn't have vacations. We had project days. We didn't have a car that started on the first try, but we had a kitchen table where every dream I ever had was treated like a blueprint for a skyscraper. I got into nursing school on a partial scholarship, but the rest? The thousands of dollars for books, scrubs, and tuition? That came from my father's overtime. For 4 years, he didn't buy a new pair of boots. He resold the same steel-toed pair 5 times. I'd see him in the kitchen at midnight, gluing the leather back together with industrial adhesive, his fingers stained black. "I'm fine, Elle," he'd say when I tried to protest. "I'm just building a foundation. You're the one who's going to build the house." I became a nurse practitioner at the city's busiest community clinic. I worked the trauma ward. I've held the hands of people taking their last breath, and I've looked into the eyes of mothers who had lost everything. I thought I knew what hard looked like. I thought I knew what class meant. Then I met Julian Sterling. It was a rainy Tuesday. Julian had come into the clinic with his father, Richard Sterling, who had suffered minor heart palpitations during a board meeting. Julian stood in the waiting room like he was a god who had accidentally wandered into a mortal's cave. He was wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my parents made in a year, looking at the peeling linoleum with a mixture of pity and disgust. "How can you work in a place like this?" he asked me later, after I'd stabilized his father. "The floors are clean," I replied, thinking of my dad. "And the people are real. That's enough for me." He laughed, and it was a sound like velvet. He told me I was refreshing. He told me I was unspoiled. For 2 years, I let that charm blind me. Julian was the man who brought me flowers every Friday. Julian was the man who told me my parents were salt of the earth. He made me feel like the princess in a storybook, never realizing that in most of those stories, the princess has to leave her family behind to enter the castle. The first time I met his mother, Constance, she was wearing cream silk and pearls the size of grapes. She looked at my hands, scrubbed clean, but with the short nails of a nurse, and said, "Healthcare." How noble. My father always said the help is the most important part of any structure. I told myself she was just old-fashioned. I told myself Julian was different. I was so busy looking at the Sterling name on the side of every building in the city that I forgot to check what kind of cement they were using. I was about to find out that the foundation wasn't just built on sand, it was built on the bodies of people like my father. The engagement was a whirlwind of flashbulbs and silk. Julian proposed on the rooftop of the Sterling Plaza, the city lights spread out below us like a carpet of diamonds. He told me he wanted to elevate me. He told me he wanted the world to see the woman who had captured his heart. But as the wedding planning began, the elevations started to feel like erasures. Constance took over everything. The church wasn't my childhood parish, it was a cathedral that felt more like a museum. The guest list wasn't my friends from the clinic. It was a directory of Julian's father's business associates. And then there was the social training. "Elena, darling," Constance would say, sipping tea in her pristine drawing room. "We must think of the optics. Your father. Dave, isn't it? He's a wonderful man, I'm sure. But perhaps we can hire a professional to handle the father of the bride's speech? We wouldn't want him to feel out of place." I fought her on every point. I told Julian I wanted my father to speak. I told him I wanted my mother to wear the dress she had sewn herself. And Julian would always squeeze my hand and say, "Of course, baby. Mom's just stressed. I'll handle it." I believed him. I believed him right up until the night of the rehearsal dinner, when I found the first red pen incident. We were at the Sterling estate, reviewing the final gala programs for tonight. I opened the velvet-bound booklet and flipped to the special thanks section. I'd written a paragraph dedicated to Dave and Linda Marshall, thanking them for 40 years of labor that had made my life possible. The paragraph was gone. In its place was a generic note of thanks to the Sterling Group family of investors. I went to Julian, my heart thudding in my chest. "Julian, where are my parents? Their names were supposed to be right here." Julian didn't even look up from his phone. "The printer said there wasn't enough space, Elle. Mom thought it was more professional this way. Don't worry about it." Everyone knows who your parents are. I worry about it, I said, my voice trembling. They're the only reason I'm standing here. Elena, please, he said, and for the first time, I heard an edge of irritation in his voice. It's one page in a program. We have 500 VIPs coming tomorrow. Can we just focus on the big picture? The big picture was becoming a blur of ivory and gold that didn't have any room for South Chicago. But I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself that once the gala was over, we'd go back to being us. Now, standing in the basement of the Excelsior, looking at my father sitting next to a trash can in overflow room B, I realized the big picture was a mural of my own humiliation. I turned and walked back toward the fire doors. I wasn't going back to accept an award. I was going back to find the man I was supposed to marry. But as I reached the door, I heard voices coming from the other side. It was Julian and Constance. They were standing in the service hallway, away from the music. Julian, you cannot let her bring them up, Constance's voice was a sharp hiss. I saw her heading down here. If she tries to move them to table 1, the Porter group will walk. They didn't pay $10,000 a plate to sit next to a man who smells like pine sol. I know, Mother, Julian's voice was tired, but it wasn't defensive. I told the coordinator to keep the door locked. I'll tell Elena there was a fire marshal issue. She's a nurse, she'll believe anything that sounds like a safety regulation. He's unsightly, Julian, Constance said. He's a janitor. He doesn't belong in the light. And frankly, the more I see of her family, the more I wonder if she belongs there either. I stood frozen, my hand on the cold metal bar of the door. My lungs felt like they were filled with glass. I waited for Julian to defend me. I waited for him to say that the man in the basement was the man who had cleaned his father's toilets so his daughter could save lives. But Julian didn't say a word. He just sighed. She's a marshal, Mom, he said. They're useful, but they're unsightly. Once the papers are signed tonight, I'll handle her. For now, just keep the wine flowing so nobody notices the help is trying to join the party. I let go of the door. The sound of the dishwashers behind me felt like a countdown. The papers. The final marriage certificate was sitting on a podium in the ballroom, waiting for my signature during the grand finale. I looked down at my silk dress. It felt like a shroud. I wasn't an elevated Sterling. I was a useful marshal. And Julian Sterling was about to find out that when you build a house on a person you think is unsightly, you better make sure they don't know how to take out the support beams. I didn't open the fire door. I turned and went back to table 40. My father looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the look on my face. Elena? What's wrong? Dad, I said, my voice a whisper of pure, cold rage. I need you to give me the envelope you've been carrying in your jacket. The one you said was for my big day. My father reached into his tuxedo and pulled out a worn, white envelope. I was going to give it to you after the speech, Elle. It's not much, just. I need it now, I said. I took the envelope and walked toward the freight elevator. I wasn't going to use the stairs this time. I wanted to arrive exactly where they least expected me. The freight elevator groaned, a slow, mechanical shudder that vibrated through the soles of my expensive silk heels. It was a stark, industrial contrast to the velvet-muffled silence of the grand ballroom above. In the small, flickering light of the lift, I opened the envelope my father had handed me. My breath hitched. It wasn't a card. It wasn't a sentimental poem. It was a cashier's check for $50,000. $50,000. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. I thought about the resold boots. I thought about 35 years of industrial bleach and the way his knuckles cracked in the winter. This wasn't just money, it was a life. It was every hour of overtime, every skipped meal, every Saturday spent scrubbing the Sterling Group's executive toilets while Julian and his mother slept in silk sheets. And then I saw the note clipped to the back. For the wedding of my dreams, L. I know the Sterlings like things a certain way. I didn't want you to feel like you couldn't keep up. Love, Dad. The elevator jolted to a halt at the kitchen level. The doors slid open to a chaos of silver trays and shouting chefs, but I didn't see any of it. I saw Julian's face in the hallway, calling my parents unsightly. I saw Constance's pearl-draped throat as she laughed about knowing your place. This check hadn't gone to my dress or the flowers. Julian had taken the contribution from my father months ago, claiming it was for the Gala fund, never telling me that he was using a janitor's life savings to buy the very champagne his mother was currently using to toast his brilliance. I stepped out of the lift, my jaw locked. I wasn't the janitor's daughter anymore. I was the person who had just realized she was standing in a burning building, and I was the only one who knew where the exits were. I walked through the swinging kitchen doors, past the startled line cooks, and straight into the blinding light of the ballroom. Julian spotted me from across the room, his eyes widening in a mixture of relief and annoyance. He started toward me, adjusting his cuffs, that rehearsed everything is under control, smile firmly in place. He had no idea that the foundation he'd built his night on had just turned to ash. The sapphire lights of the ballroom felt like cold needles against my skin as I moved through the crowd. I didn't go to Julian. I didn't go to Constance. I went to the welcome table near the entrance, where a stack of the gold-rimmed Gala programs sat in a neat, arrogant pile. I picked one up and turned to the back. I looked at the special thanks section again. No Dave Marshall. No Linda Marshall. Just the cold, corporate font of the Sterling Group. I thought about my mother, hunched over her sewing machine in South Chicago, stitching the lace on her dress by hand because she didn't want to embarrass the Sterlings with something off a department store rack. She had spent 40 years folding laundry so I could wear silk, and Constance Sterling couldn't even find the space for her name in a 10-page booklet. Elena. There you are. Julian's hand was on my arm, firm and possessive. He leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon. Where have you been? The board members are asking for you. And your dress, is that a smudge on the hem? You look like you've been in the basement. I was in the basement, Julian, I said, my voice as flat as a heart monitor after the pulse stops. I was visiting the people you put there. Julian's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went hard. He pulled me closer, stepping into my personal space until I could see the tiny, frantic pulse in his temple. We discussed this, L. The fire marshal. The capacity limits. It's a safety issue. They're fine down there. I sent them a bottle of the good scotch. Safety, I repeated. Is that what you call it when you hide the people who paid for your tuxedo? Because I have the check, Julian. The $50,000 my father gave you. The money you told me was part of the Sterling grant for the Gala. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He just let out a long, weary sigh. Elena, don't be naive. That money was a drop in the bucket. I took it because it made him feel involved. It gave him a sense of belonging. You should be thanking me for letting him feel like a part of this world. A part of this world? I looked around at the room, at the crystal chandeliers that looked like frozen tears. You put them next to the dishwashers. You scrubbed their names from the program. You called them unsightly in a hallway while your mother laughed. You didn't take his money to make him feel involved, Julian. You took it because you think people like my father are there to be used until they're worn out, and then you throw them in the trash. Keep your voice down, he hissed, his grip tightening. The mayor is 10 feet away. Tonight is about the merger. It's about the Sterling name. If you want to be a Sterling, you need to start acting like one. That means loyalty, Elena. That means discretion. I'm not a Sterling, I said, pulling my arm away. And after tonight, I'm never going to be. I walked away from him, disappearing into the crowd before he could grab me again. I needed to find the one thing that made this night binding. The marriage certificate. It was sitting on a velvet cushion near the podium, a piece of paper that represented the final brick in the wall Julian was building around me. I saw Constance standing near it, her hand resting on the podium as if she already owned my signature. She looked at me and tilted her head, her pearls gleaming like shark teeth. She thought she had one. She thought she had successfully managed the unsightly variables. But as I reached into my clutch and felt the sharp, cold edge of the pen my father had given me for my graduation, I knew that the only thing getting signed tonight was the Sterling social death warrant. The music shifted to a crescendo, a dramatic swell of strings that signaled the grand finale. Julian was on the stage now, standing at the microphone, the spotlight catching the gold threads in his tie. He looked every bit the savior of the city, the visionary leader of the Sterling Group. Behind him, on the giant LED screen, images of the Sterling skyscrapers flashed in a slow, majestic loop. Tonight is about legacy, Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, rich and confident. It's about building structures that stand the test of time. But more than that, it's about the people we choose to build those structures with. He gestured to me, a warm, inviting wave. The spotlight swung toward me, blinding and hot. 500 faces turned, their eyes expectant, their applause a polite, rhythmic roar. I started to walk toward the stage. Each step felt like I was moving through deep water. I looked at Constance, who was beaming from the front row. I looked at the Porter Group investors, the people who didn't sit next to janitors. And then, I looked at the very back of the room, where the heavy oak doors were being guarded by Sterling security. I reached the stage and stepped up to the podium. Julian took my hand, his fingers cold, his smile never wavering. He leaned into the mic and now, to finalize this union of two great traditions, Elena and I will sign our marriage certificate before you all. He leaned in close, his voice a whisper for my ears only. Sign the paper, Elena. Don't make a scene. If you do this, I'll move your parents to a 5-star hotel tomorrow. I'll give them whatever you want. Just sign it. I looked down at the certificate. It was beautiful, heavy parchment with gold leaf borders. The Sterling name was written in a sprawling, arrogant script. I picked up the pen. The room went silent. A heavy, breathless hush that made the sound of the air conditioning feel like a roar. I looked out at the audience, at the 500 people who thought they were watching a fairy tale. And then, I saw the fire door at the side of the room. It wasn't locked. My father was standing there. He had walked up the service stairs, his tuxedo rumpled, his resoled boots squeaking on the polished floor. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be in the basement, in the dark, in the silence. But he stood there, his back straight, his eyes locked on mine. He didn't look unsightly. He looked like the only real thing in a room full of glass. I looked back at Julian. I looked at the pen in my hand. Julian, I said, my voice carrying through the microphone, clear and cold. You're right. Tonight is about legacy. It's about the things we build that can't be torn down. I didn't sign the paper. Instead, I picked up the marriage certificate and held it up for the entire room to see. But you can't build a legacy on a lie, I said. And you certainly can't build one on a stolen foundation. I felt Julian's hand tighten on my arm, a warning squeeze that was meant to silence me. But I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at the woman in the third row, a senior reporter for the City Chronicle, who already had her phone out, recording every word. Before we sign this, I said, my voice rising. I think there are two people who deserve to be in this spotlight more than I do. I pointed toward the fire door. Julian, tell the fire marshal to stand down. Because the people who actually paid for this gala are coming in. The room fractured. Julian's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. Constance stood up, her pearls rattling against her chest. I saw the security guards moving toward the fire door, but they were too late. My father had already stepped into the light, and he wasn't alone. He had brought the entire staff from Overflow Room B with him. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. And that was when I realized that Julian's papers weren't the only thing sitting on the podium. There was a second envelope. A black one. And as I reached for it, I saw Julian's eyes go wide with a terror that no amount of sterling money could fix. The black envelope sat on the mahogany podium like a dark omen, its heavy vellum absorbing the glare of the spotlights. Julian's hand, which had been clamped like a vice around my wrist, suddenly went limp. I could feel the tremor in his fingers. He looked at the envelope, then at me, and for a fleeting second, the sterling polish cracked completely, revealing a raw, jagged terror. This wasn't part of the rehearsal. "Elena, don't," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "Whatever you think is in there, it's a misunderstanding. We can talk about this in private. Just put it down. Think about your career. Think about your parents." "I am thinking about my parents, Julian," I said, my voice amplified by the microphone, echoing off the marble walls like a judgment. "I'm thinking about how my father spent 40 years cleaning the grease off your family's gears while you were busy trying to pretend the machine ran on magic. And I'm thinking about what happens when the grease finally stops." I picked up the black envelope. The room was so silent I could hear the rustle of my own silk sleeves. 500 people, the mayor, the developers, the Porter Group partners, held their breath. I slid a single sheet of paper out. It wasn't a letter. It was a forensic accounting report. "You told me tonight was about legacy," I said, looking directly into the camera of the City Chronicle reporter. "You told these investors that the Sterling Group was a fortress of stability. But this report says something different. It says the Sapphire merger isn't a growth strategy. It's a life raft. Because the Sterling Group is $40 million in the red, and the only reason you haven't collapsed yet is because you've been borrowing from the employee pension funds, including the one my father worked 40 years to earn." A collective gasp rippled through the room. A wave of sound that started at the VIP tables and crashed against the stage. Constance Sterling slumped into her seat, her dimension-sized pearls suddenly looking like a weight around her neck. Julian reached for the microphone, his movements jerky and desperate, but I stepped back, holding the paper high. "Tonight was supposed to be the night I signed my life over to you," I said, my voice vibrating with a decade's worth of suppressed South Chicago rage. "But you forgot who you were dealing with. You thought I was just the useful Marshall. You forgot that nurses are trained to spot a rot before the patient even knows they're sick. And Julian? Your empire is terminal." I looked at my father, still standing by the fire door. He didn't look like a janitor. He looked like the man who had raised a daughter to recognize a predator, even when he was wearing a $7,000 suit. I turned back to the podium, but I didn't reach for the marriage certificate. I reached for the $50,000 check Julian had stolen from my father's life savings. I held it up, the white paper flashing under the sapphire lights. "This is the foundation you tried to steal," I said. "But the thing about foundations is that once they're gone, the rest of the house doesn't just sit there. It follows." I didn't sign the paper. I tore it. The sound of the heavy parchment ripping in half was amplified by the mic, a sharp, definitive crack that signaled the end of the Sterling era. Julian lunged for me, his face a mask of blind, aristocratic fury, but he was stopped by a wall of blue. The fire marshal issue he had lied about had just become a real police presence, and they weren't there for the capacity limits. They were there for the pension fraud. The aftermath of a social execution is a strange, quiet thing. As the police led Julian and Richard Sterling out through the service entrance, the same entrance they had forced my parents to use, the ballroom transformed from a palace into a crime scene. The chandeliers were still shining, the lilies were still fragrant, but the Sterling magic had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the smell of expensive sweat and panic. I stood on the stage, the torn marriage certificate at my feet, and watched the elite of the city scramble for the exits like rats on a sinking ship. The Porter Group didn't walk out because of my father's unsightly boots, they walked out because their investments were currently being liquidated by the feds. The mayor had vanished through a side door 10 minutes ago, his friendship with the Sterlings ending the second the word fraud hit the airwaves. Constance was still in the front row, sitting as still as a statue in a graveyard. She looked at me, and for the first time, there was no pity in her eyes. There was only a cold, hollow recognition. She had tried to hide the help in the basement, and the help had ended up owning the building. I stepped off the stage and walked toward the fire door. My father was waiting for me, his arm around my mother, who was finally wearing the dress she had sewn herself in the light of a room that was no longer allowed to ignore her. "Elena," my father said, his voice thick. "You didn't have to do that. The 50,000. I gave it freely." "I know you did, Dad," I said, taking his hand. His skin was rough, a map of 40 years of honest labor, and it felt more like home than any silk gown ever could. But he didn't take it freely. He stole it. And in this family, we don't let people steal the foundation. We walked out of the Grand Excelsior, not through the kitchen, but through the massive gold leaf front doors. The paparazzi were a frenzy of flashes on the sidewalk, but they weren't looking for a janitor's daughter. They were looking for the woman who had just dismantled the most powerful family in the city. But as we reached the car, my phone buzzed in my clutch. It was a text from an unknown number, but I knew the cadence. It was Julian's personal assistant. "Elena, check the black envelope again. There's a second page tucked into the lining." Julian wasn't just stealing the pensions. He was selling the land under the South Chicago Clinic to a private developer. They're scheduled to demolish it on Monday. My heart stopped. The community clinic. The linoleum floors my father cleaned. The ward where I'd saved lives. Julian hadn't just been stealing my past, he was currently leveling my future. I looked at my father, then back at the glittering monstrosity of the Excelsior. The war wasn't over. It had just moved from the ballroom to the streets I grew up on. "Dad," I said, my voice tight. "We need to go to the clinic. Now." The community clinic on 47th Street looked the same as it always did, a squat, brick building with peeling paint and a neon open sign that flickered like a dying pulse. To the Sterlings, it was an unsightly line item on a balance sheet. To me, it was the place where I had learned that the only thing that matters in this world is who stays with you when the lights go out. We pulled up to the curb at 2 a.m. The street was quiet, but as I stepped out of the car, I saw the white vans parked in the alley. No logos. No markings. Just the kind of anonymous efficiency the Sterling Group used when they wanted a problem to disappear before the sun came up. I walked toward the front door, my silk dress trailing in the grime of the sidewalk. A man in a dark windbreaker stepped out of the shadows, a clipboard in his hand. He looked at my gown, then at my face, and I saw the flicker of recognition. "This is private property, miss," he said, his voice flat. "Demolition prep starts at 4. You need to move your vehicle." "I'm Elena Marshall," I said, stepping into his light. "And I'm a nurse practitioner at this clinic. This building isn't just property. It's a designated health site for 3,000 families." "It was a health site," the man corrected. "The Sterling Group sold the land to Vanguard Development last month. We have the permits. Everything is legal." "Vanguard Development is a shell company owned by Richard Sterling," I said, the words tasting like copper. "The sale was a fraudulent transfer to hide assets from the pension creditors. The permits are based on a lie." The man shrugged. "I don't deal with the law, Mississippi. I deal with the wrecking ball. Unless you have an injunction, this building comes down on Monday morning." I looked at the clinic, at the dark windows where I'd spent so many nights. Julian hadn't just tried to erase my parents, he was trying to erase the very soil they stood on. I reached into my bag and pulled out the second page from the black envelope. It was the deed of sale. And there, at the bottom, was a signature I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't Julian's. It wasn't Richard's. It was a signature from the clinic's own board of directors, the person who had supposedly protected us. I looked at the name, and the world went cold. It was a name I had trusted for 7 years. "Dad," I whispered, my voice breaking for the first time all night. "Look at the board signature." My father leaned in, squinting at the paper in the dim street lamp light. He went still. The resoled boots he was so proud of suddenly seemed to grow heavy. "Elena," he said, his voice full of a pain I'd never heard before. "This can't be right." I looked up at the clinic, at the shadow moving behind the glass of the director's office. The door opened, and a figure stepped out onto the sidewalk, silhouetted against the flickering neon. They weren't wearing a tuxedo. They were wearing a white lab coat. "Elena," the director said, their voice calm and devastatingly familiar. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out. Julian was always too sloppy with his paperwork." I stood there, realizing that the unsightly foundation wasn't just being attacked from the outside. The rot had been inside the house the whole time. "Why?" I asked. The director stepped into the light, and as they did, I saw the small, sapphire pin on their lapel, the same one Julian had given to his most loyal partners. "Because, Elena," they said, "everyone has a price. Even the people who scrub the floors." And then, they reached into their pocket and pulled out a cell phone. "He's here," they said. "And he has the check." The sapphire pin on Director Miller's lapel caught the flickering neon of the clinic's open sign, a tiny, glittering betrayal that made the air in my lungs turn to ice. This was the man who had given me my first stethoscope. The man who had sat at my kitchen table and told my father that his hard work was the heartbeat of the community. And now, he was standing on the cracked sidewalk, reporting our position like we were high-value targets. "He's here," Miller said into the phone, his voice devoid of warmth. "And he has the check." I looked at the $50,000 check in my hand, the paper damp with the humidity of the Chicago night. Julian hadn't just stolen it to fund a gala. He had funneled it through Miller to ensure the clinic's board stayed silent while the Sterling Group dismantled the only safety net this neighborhood had. It was a cycle of theft so complete it felt like a physical weight on my chest. They had used my father's life savings to pay for the shovel that was about to bury his legacy. "Why, Arthur?" my father asked, his voice cracking. He stepped toward the director, his boots crunching on the glass of a broken light fixture. "We were friends. I cleaned your office when you were just a resident. I watched your kids grow up. And I watched you stay exactly where you were, Dave," Miller replied, stepping back into the shadow of the doorway. "For 35 years. You scrubbed the same floors, lived in the same 2-bedroom house. I didn't want that for myself." Julian offered me a seat at the table. A seat at the real table. All I had to do was facilitate a strategic transition of the property. A strategic transition? I hissed, stepping between my father and the man I once called a mentor. "You sold the health of 3,000 people for a sapphire pin and a payout. You signed the death warrant for this clinic because you were tired of the smell of pine sol. The Sterling Group was going to take it anyway, Elena," Miller said, his eyes shifting toward the white vans in the alley. "I just made sure I wasn't the one crushed under the rubble. Now, give me the check. Julian's creditors are already circling. If that money isn't accounted for in the Sterling accounts tonight, they'll come for your father's pension next. They'll claim it was a fraudulent gift. They'll leave him with nothing." I looked at the white vans. The side doors slid open, and 4 men in dark tactical gear stepped out. They weren't demolition crews. They were private security, the kind of disposal specialists the Sterling Group used when the law was too slow. "The check, Elena," Miller repeated. "Give it to me, and I'll tell them you were never here. I'll say the clinic was empty. You can take your parents and disappear. It's the only way to save what's left of your family." I looked at the check. I looked at the dark, hungry windows of the clinic. And then, I reached into my clutch for the pen my father had given me. "The only thing we're disappearing is your seat at the table, Arthur," I said. The security team was 10 feet away. I grabbed my father's hand and pulled him toward the side entrance. I still had my key. We weren't just protecting a building anymore. We were protecting the evidence of a crime that went deeper than any pension fund. As the heavy metal door slammed shut behind us and I turned the deadbolt, the sound of a sledgehammer hitting the front glass echoed through the lobby. The siege of the Marshall family had moved into the dark. The clinic at night is a labyrinth of shadows and the scent of sterile alcohol. It's a place designed for healing, but in the dark, with the sound of breaking glass echoing from the lobby, it felt like a tomb. I led my father through the triage ward, our footsteps muffled by the linoleum he had spent decades keeping pristine. "Elena, what are we doing?" he whispered, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We should have stayed outside." "The police are busy at the Excelsior, Dad," I said, pulling him into the director's office. "And Miller has the local precinct in his pocket. If we stayed outside, they'd have taken the check and the ledger. I need the blue ledger." I went straight to Miller's desk. I didn't look for money. I looked for the blue ledger, the physical record of the clinic's donations. Miller was old-fashioned. He liked to keep a paper trail of the grants he received. I found it in a hidden compartment. I flipped it open, my eyes scanning the entries. There it was. April 14th, Sterling Group Infrastructure Grant, $50,000. And right next to it, a handwritten note in Miller's script, source, Marshall Education Fund. Transfer authorized by J. Sterling. The proof was right here. They had used my father's money as a bribe to the director to authorize the sale of the land. "I have it," I whispered. "They're in the ward," a voice shouted from the hallway. It was Miller. "Find them. I want that ledger and the girl." The heavy thud of tactical boots hit the linoleum. I looked at the window. It was barred. "Dad, listen to me," I said, grabbing his shoulders. "I need you to take the ledger. There's a laundry chute in the back of this office. It goes straight to the basement, but there's a crawl space halfway down that leads to the alley. You're the only one who knows how to navigate the ductwork in this building." "I'm not leaving you, Elena," he said. "You're not leaving me, you're saving the evidence," I said, pressing the ledger into his hands. "If they catch me, they'll search me. They'll find the check, but they won't find this. This ledger is the only thing that puts Miller and Julian in a cage. Go. Get to Margot's house. Call the feds. Not the local cops. The feds." The door to the office shuddered under a heavy shoulder. The wood began to splinter. "Go," I hissed. My father looked at me, a lifetime of protection and pride warring in his eyes. He nodded once, grabbed the ledger, and disappeared into the chute just as the office door exploded inward. The security guards burst in. They saw me standing behind the desk, my silk gown torn at the shoulder, my red pen clutched in my hand. "Where's the old man?" the taller one asked. "And where's the book?" "The old man is already gone," I said, my voice vibrating with a cold courage. "And the book is somewhere you'll never find it. Search her," Miller's voice came from the doorway. He walked in, his lab coat stained with dust. "And be thorough. She's a nurse. She knows how to hide things." I felt the rough hands of the guards on my arms. They found the $50,000 check in seconds. Miller took it, looking at the cashier's check with a mixture of greed and relief. "You should have just stayed in the basement, Elena," Miller said, tucking the check into his pocket. "It's much safer in the dark." "The light is coming, Arthur," I said. Miller didn't flinch. He just nodded to the guards. "Take her to the basement. We'll wait for the demolition crew. Once the building is down, we'll say she was a squatter who got caught in the collapse. A tragic accident." As they dragged me toward the stairs, the sound of the first construction crane roared to life outside. But as the basement door slammed shut behind us, I felt a vibration in the floor that wasn't the crane. It was the rhythmic, steady thud of the industrial dishwashers in the laundry room next door, the sound my mother had lived with for 40 years. And I realized that the basement wasn't my tomb. It was my territory. The basement of the community clinic was a cavern of concrete and exposed pipes. The security guards threw me into the laundry room. "Stay put, princess," the guard said, locking the heavy steel mesh door. "You've got about 20 minutes before the wrecking ball makes this your permanent residence." They walked back toward the stairs. I sat on the floor, the cold of the cement seeping through my silk dress. I looked around at the industrial washers and the maze of copper pipes. I thought about my father. He wasn't just a janitor. He was the man who knew the pressure points of this building. And he had taught me how to find the main shutoff. I looked at the boiler in the corner. It was an old-fashioned steam system. "High pressure is like a secret, Elle," he used to say. "Keep it contained long enough, and it'll take the whole house down." I jammed the pen into the pressure regulator, twisting until I heard the sharp, shrill hiss of escaping steam. I blocked the manual override. The gauge on the boiler began to climb. Yellow. Orange. Outside, the first thud of the wrecking ball hit the upper floors. The building shuddered. I had to get out. I climbed the stacked industrial washers. The silk of my dress caught on the metal edges, tearing as I hauled myself up. I reached the edge of the chute. The building groaned again, a deep, metallic scream. The boiler began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum I could feel in my teeth. The pressure was in the red. I pulled myself into the chute, my fingers raw. I reached the crawl space and crawled. The air was thick with dust. I could hear the security guards returning to the basement. "She's gone. The door is still locked, but she's gone. Check the boiler." "What is that noise?" I didn't stop. I pushed through the final vent cover and tumbled out into the cold air of the alley. I ran. I reached the end of the alley just as the clinic exploded. It wasn't the wrecking ball. It was the boiler. A massive, white plume of steam and brick erupted from the basement, the force of the blast shaking the entire block. The construction crane toppled, its long neck snapping as it crashed into the white vans of the security team. The clinic was a ruin. But as the dust settled, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the police line. It was my father. And he wasn't alone. Beside him stood the reporter from the City Chronicle, her camera flashes cutting through the steam. And next to her were federal agents. My father saw me, his face a mixture of terror and absolute pride. He held up the blue ledger. "I have it, Elle," he shouted. "I have it all." But as I started toward him, a car screeched around the corner. A black Mercedes with the Sterling crest. The back door flew open, and Julian Sterling stepped out. He didn't look like a prince. He looked like a man who had nothing left to lose but his revenge. He looked straight at me, and in his hand, he held a black, velvet-bound folder. "You think you won, Elena," he shouted. "You think a ledger is enough to stop a Sterling?" He opened the folder and held up a document with a sapphire blue seal. "This is the trust agreement for your child, Elena," he said. "The one you haven't told me about yet. And according to this, if you ever take a Sterling to court, the custody reverts to Constance. Legally. Irrevocably." I froze. The world went silent. Julian had one more foundation to steal. "You didn't know I knew, did you?" Julian whispered. "Constance always checks the medical records of the help." The cold morning air of South Chicago felt like a physical weight, but it was nothing compared to the silence that followed Julian's words. I looked at the black folder in his hand, at that sapphire seal that seemed to pulse with a predatory light. He knew. In the world of the Sterlings, there is no such thing as a private medical record. I felt my hand instinctively go to my stomach, a protective reflex. 2 months. 2 months of morning sickness I'd explained away as stress. I had thought I was building a wall around this child, a life that would never have to breathe the suffocating air of the Sterling estate. But Julian hadn't just breached the wall, he had designed the trapdoor. "You're lying," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The custody laws in this state are written by men who play golf with my father." "Elena," Julian interrupted. "Constance has already filed the unfit parent petition. Between your public breakdown at the gala, your presence at a criminal explosion, and the fact that you're standing in a gutter in a ruined silk dress, who do you think the judge is going to choose? The janitor's daughter, or the philanthropic matriarch with a nursery already staffed by 3 world-class nannies?" I looked at my father. He heard every word. I saw his shoulders sag. "He's not a Sterling, Julian," I said. "He's a Marshall. And you're not taking him." "It's a choice, Julian said, his voice dropping into that manipulative charm. "Give me the check. Tell the feds that the ledger was a forgery. Retract the pension fraud statement. Do that, and Constance drops the petition. We'll set up a quiet trust. You get your hero moment, and we get our legacy back. Everyone stays in their lane." I looked at the ruin of the clinic. I looked at Director Miller, who was watching me with a greedy glint in his eyes. He was waiting for me to prove that everyone, even Elena Marshall, has a price. But then I looked at the $50,000 check. I looked at the resold boots of the man who had spent 35 years cleaning floors so I would never have to bow to a man like Julian Sterling. And I realized that Julian's choice was just another basement, another place where the truth goes to die so the elite can keep their shine. "You're right, Julian," I said, stepping toward him. "Tonight was about a choice. But it wasn't mine. It was yours." I didn't hand him the check. Instead, I turned to the City Chronicle reporter, who was still holding her camera. "Julian Sterling just admitted to blackmailing a whistleblower using a threat of illegal custody seizure," I said. "And he just confirmed that the Sterling Group has access to private medical records through illegal back channels. Record that, Carol. Because that's not just a scandal. That's a federal civil rights violation." Julian's face went from triumphant to a deep purple. He lunged for the reporter, but the federal agents were faster. "Julian Sterling," the lead agent said. "You're under arrest for witness intimidation, pension fraud, and conspiracy to commit arson." As they forced Julian against the hood of the Mercedes, the black folder fell into the gutter. The sapphire seal was covered in soot and grease. I watched him go with a cold clarity. He had tried to steal my past, my present, and my future. But he forgot that a foundation built on a person you think is unsightly is only as strong as that person chooses to be. I let go. And the Sterling Group finally hit the ground. The weeks that followed were a montage of legal depositions. The Sterling Group dissolved. Richard and Julian were indicted on 42 counts of financial crimes. Constance was stripped of her board seats. But for the Marshalls, the fallout was different. I stood in the kitchen of my parents' house. The same kitchen where the radiator hissed. The $50,000 check was back in my father's hand. The feds had cleared it as his legal property. "Dad, what are you going to do with it?" I asked. He looked at his boots, a new pair this time. He looked at my mother. "We're rebuilding, he said. "Not a house. The clinic." He took the $50,000 and used it as the seed money for the Margaret Marshall Community Health Center. The city, desperate to distance itself from the scandal, had granted us a 99-year lease for $1. My father was the first person to pick up a shovel. He wasn't the janitor this time, he was the site foreman. I went back to work as the clinical director. We didn't have sapphire pins. We had a staff of nurses who didn't care about optics. And then there was the baby. I sat on the porch of my new apartment and looked at the ultrasound photo. Julian had been right about one thing: the child was a Sterling by blood. But as I watched my father in the yard below, teaching neighborhood kids how to fix a leaky faucet, I knew the child would be a Marshall by soul. Constance's custody petition had been laughed out of court. The judge had looked at the evidence of the blackmail and the pension theft and told Constance Sterling she was lucky she wasn't in a jail cell next to her son. Legacy isn't a name on a building, Miss Sterling, the judge had said. Legacy is the people who show up when the building falls down. I looked at the city skyline. The Sterling Plaza was still there, but the sign was gone. It was just a glass box now. But the clinic on 47th Street? It was glowing. The neon sign had been replaced with a steady, white light. My mother walked onto the porch, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You think he'll look like him?" she asked softly. "Maybe," I said. "But he'll walk like Dad. He'll have the resoled boots of a man who never once looked down at someone unless he was reaching down to pick them up." If you're still listening to the story of the janitor's daughter, I want you to look at the room you're sitting in right now. I want you to think about the people who made the chair you're sitting on, the people who scrub the floor beneath your feet, and the people who are working a graveyard shift so your world keeps spinning. For a long time, I was ashamed of the smell of pine sol. I let a man in a $7,000 suit convince me that my family was unsightly because they weren't part of the big picture. But here is the final truth I learned: the big picture is a lie. It's a painting made of glass and ego, designed to hide the fact that the people at the top are terrified. They're terrified because they know that if we ever stop scrubbing their floors, if we ever stop fixing their pipes, their world stops turning. Julian Sterling thought he could put my parents in a basement and still keep his legacy. He didn't understand that the basement is the foundation. And if you treat the foundation like trash, the penthouse eventually meets the pavement. My father is 70 now. He still wakes up at 5 a.m. But now, when he walks into the Margaret Marshall Health Center, he goes to the director's office to kiss his daughter and his grandson. I'm Elena Marshall. I'm a nurse, a mother, and the daughter of the greatest man I've ever known. I live in a city that is learning to value the shine of a clean floor over the shimmer of a sapphire pin. And as for Julian? I heard he's working in the laundry room of the state penitentiary. I hope he's learning how to fold the sheets. I hope he's learning that there is a specific kind of dignity in manual labor. But most of all, I hope he realizes that the view from the basement is actually quite clear once you stop pretending you're a god. Thank you for listening. And remember, never let anyone tell you that your family isn't enough. Because the people who look down on you are usually just afraid you'll realize they're the ones standing on your shoulders. I'm Elena Marshall, and I'm finally home.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.